They said she was dead before she even hit the ground. When the 4:15 Union Pacific train screeched into the remote outpost of Blackwater Ridge, Wyoming, on a freezing November afternoon in 1887, nobody expected a woman to stumble off the cargo car. She wasn't wearing a silk gown or a traveler's coat. She was wrapped in a blood-soaked horse blanket, her face a map of purple bruises and secrets. Witnesses say she took 2 steps, whispered a name that wasn't hers, and collapsed into the mud. The town was ready to bury her, but they didn't count on the one man who hated visitors, a reclusive, gun-slinging rancher named Garrett Halloway, being the one to catch her. This isn't just a romance. It's a story of survival, a corrupt empire, and the winter that changed the West forever. This is the true account of Evelyn Sterling. The whistle of the Union Pacific No. 9 tore through the silence of the Wyoming plains like a dying scream. It was late November, the kind of cold that didn't just sit on the skin, but burrowed into the bone, turning the marrow into ice. Inside the third-class passenger car, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco and coal dust. But Evelyn Sterling wasn't in the passenger car. She was huddled in the corner of a livestock transport wagon, near the back, wedged between crates of mining equipment and a nervous quarter-horse that stomped every time the tracks rattled. Evelyn didn't mind the cold. In fact, the numbness in her fingers and toes was a mercy. It distracted her from the fire burning in her ribs, 2 cracked, maybe 3, and the throbbing ache behind her left eye, where the heavy gold ring of her Uncle Beauregard Sterling had connected with her cheekbone 3 days ago. She had paid the brakeman, a grease-stained man named Elias Thorne, her last gold earring, to look the other way. "Don't come out till we hit Blackwater," he'd grunted, pocketing the jewelry. "And if you die back there, don't expect me to haul your body out." Evelyn shifted, stifling a whimper as the crate dug into her bruised spine. She wasn't Evelyn anymore. That girl, the heiress to the Sterling silver mines in Nevada, the girl who wore French lace and played the pianoforte, had died in a locked cellar in Carson City. The woman shivering in the straw was nobody. A ghost. The train began to decelerate, the grinding of metal on metal, sending sparks flying past the wooden slats of the wagon. Blackwater Ridge. It sounded like a bruise. It was perfect. The doors slid open with a rusted groan. The light was blinding, grey and harsh. Evelyn tried to stand, but her legs were like water. She grabbed the edge of a mining crate, her knuckles white, her fingernails dirt-caked and broken. She had to move. If she stayed, the brakeman would toss her out like refuse. Or worse, the telegrams sent by her uncle would catch up to her. Wanted Evelyn Sterling, mental hysteria, dangerous, reward. $5,000. She stumbled toward the opening. The station platform was little more than wooden planks laid over the mud. A few people milled about a station master with a handlebar moustache. 2 women in heavy wool shawls clutching baskets, and a few rough-looking men leaning against the wall of the depot, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes. Evelyn took a breath. It rattled in her chest. Just walk, she told herself. Just walk to the boarding house. Find a room. Hide. She stepped down. Her boot hit the slick wood, and her knee buckled. The pain was immediate and blinding, shooting up her leg and exploding in her hip. She pitched forward. The world tilted sideways. The grey sky swapped places with the muddy planks. She expected the hard impact, the taste of dirt. Instead, she hit something solid. Something warm. It smelled of saddle leather, pine resin, and rain. "Easy there," a voice rumbled. It was deep rough, like gravel crunching under heavy boots. Evelyn forced her eyes open. Her vision was swimming, black spots dancing in the periphery. Looming over her was a mountain of a man. He wore a canvas duster coat, stained with mud and oil, a low-brimmed Stetson, pulled down tight, and a scarf that obscured half his face. But she saw his eyes. They were the color of steel, hard and unyielding, yet currently narrowed in something that looked like annoyance rather than concern.
I'm fine,
she whispered, the lie tasting like copper in her mouth. She tried to push away from him, but her body betrayed her. Her legs gave out completely. The man caught her again, his grip iron tight on her arm. He looked down at his glove, seeing the smear of fresh blood where he had touched her side. His gaze snapped back to her face, taking in the swollen jaw, the split lip, the terrified wideness of her eyes. "You ain't fine, lady," he said flatly. "You're bleeding out."
"Let me go,"
she gasped, panic flaring brighter than the pain.
"He'll find me."
"Please." "Who?" "The devil," she breathed. And then the darkness finally took her. Garrett Halloway hated town. He hated the noise, he hated the prying eyes of the townsfolk who whispered about his past, and he especially hated complications. He had come to the station for one thing, a shipment of barbed wire to fence off the northern pasture of his property, the Iron Rock Ranch. He hadn't come for a half-dead woman dropping into his arms like a sack of feed. He stood there on the platform, the woman limp against his chest. She was impossibly light, frail as a bird. The station master, a busybody named Horace Pringle, came bustling over his eyes, widening behind his spectacles. "Good Lord, Garrett. Who is that? Is she dead?" "Not yet." Garrett grunted. He shifted her weight easily, lifting her into a cradle carry. Her head lolled back, exposing the dark bruising around her throat. Garrett's jaw tightened. Someone hadn't just hit her. Someone had tried to end her. "Fetch Doc Caldwell," Horace stammered. "Take her into the station." Garrett looked at the station, a drafty, dirty room, filled with people who were already craning their necks to gawk. He looked down at the woman. Her skin was translucent, pale as milk, making the bruises look stark and violent. She wore a dress that had once been expensive, high-quality linen, now shredded and stained. "No," Garrett said. "Doc's drunk by noon on Tuesdays. She won't survive the wait." "Where are you taking her?" Horace asked, scandalized. "You can't take an unmarried woman to your ranch, Garrett." "The Propriety don't stop bleeding, Horace." Garrett turned and strode toward his wagon. His horses, two massive roans named Thunder and Ash, flicked their ears as he approached. He laid the woman gently in the bed of the wagon, arranging the straw and throwing a heavy buffalo hide over her. She didn't stir. He climbed onto the bench seat, snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the whispers of Blackwater Ridge behind. The ride to Iron Rock was 5 miles of rough terrain. Garrett drove slower than usual, his eyes constantly flicking back to the bundle in the wagon bed. He cursed himself under his breath. He was a man who wanted solitude. He had spent the last 5 years building walls, both literal and emotional, to keep the world out. He had his own demons, his own scars from a life he'd left behind in Texas as a bounty hunter. He didn't need a stray. But when she had looked at him, terrified and broken, whispering about the devil, something in his gut had twisted. A familiar coldness. He knew what it looked like when someone was running from hell. He'd done it himself. When they arrived at the ranch, the sun was dipping below the peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley. The ranch house was sturdy, built of rough-hewn logs and stone, sitting in the shadow of a massive iron ore cliff face. Garrett carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the wind. He laid her on the cot in the spare room, a room that hadn't been used since his brother died 3 years ago. He lit the kerosene lamp and got a good look at her for the first time. She was young, maybe 22. Her hair, matted with blood and straw, was a deep, rich auburn. He fetched a basin of warm water and a clean rag. Garrett wasn't a doctor, but he knew trauma. He'd patched up bullet holes and knife wounds in saloons from Abilene to Tombstone. He hesitated, his hands hovering over the buttons of her torn bodice. "Sorry, ma'am," he muttered to the unconscious woman. "Just need to see the damage." He worked quickly, clinical and detached. Ribs were definitely broken. Her left ankle was swollen to the size of a melon, but the worst was her back. When he turned her slightly, he saw the lash marks, old ones, silver and faded, crisscrossed by new angry welts. Garrett froze. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a random attack. This was systematic. This was ownership. He cleaned the wounds with whiskey and bound her ribs with strips of clean linen. He set her ankle as gently as he could, though she moaned in her sleep, a low, pained sound that made the hair on his arms stand up. He stoked the fire in the hearth, pulling a chair up to the bedside. He took his Colt peacemaker from his holster, spun the cylinder, and set it on the small table next to him. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know who was chasing her. But Garrett Halloway had a rule: what he found on his land stayed on his land. And if this devil she spoke of came looking, he'd find the devil waiting for him. For 3 days she burned. The fever took hold that first night, turning her skin clammy and hot. She thrashed on the narrow cot, crying out names that Garrett didn't know. Beauregard, no, please, not the cellar. My money, my mother's money. Garrett barely slept. He became her shadow. He spooned water mixed with willow bark broth between her cracked lips. He placed cool rags on her forehead. He listened to her delirium, piecing together a fractured puzzle. She was rich, or she had been. There was an inheritance. There was a man named Beauregard, an uncle, perhaps, a husband. And there was fear, a deep primal fear of being locked away. On the second night, a blizzard struck. The wind howled around the cabin like a pack of wolves. Garrett was dozing in the chair when a crash woke him. He jerked awake, hand instantly on his gun. The woman Evelyn, though he didn't know her name yet, had fallen out of bed. She was crawling across the wooden floor, dragging her bad leg, clawing toward the door. Her eyes were open, but unseeing, glazed with fever. "Have to leave," she rasped. The train is leaving." Garrett was across the room in 2 strides. He scooped her up. She fought him surprisingly strong in her panic. Her nails dug into his neck, drawing blood. "Let me go! He'll kill you if he finds me here," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Nobody is finding you." Garrett set his voice a low command. He pinned her arms gently to her sides, holding her tight against his chest to stop her thrashing. "You're at Iron Rock. The snow's 10 feet deep. God himself couldn't get up the pass tonight." She went still, trembling violently. She looked up at him, her eyes momentarily clearing, finding his face in the dim lamplight. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I'm the guy holding you together," Garrett said. She slumped against him, the fight draining away. He killed my father," she murmured, the confession slipping out before she passed out again. "He made it look like an accident. And now I'm the only loose end." Garrett carried her back to the bed. He tucked the blankets around her, his expression grim. Murder. He walked to the window, looking out at the swirling white darkness. He knew what this meant. Men who killed for money didn't stop because of a train ride. They kept coming. The next morning, the fever broke. Garrett was in the kitchen frying bacon and brewing strong black coffee when he heard the creak of floorboards. He turned. She was standing in the doorway of the bedroom. She was leaning heavily on the wall, wearing one of his old flannel shirts that swallowed her small frame. She looked like a stiff breeze would knock her over, but her chin was held high. The fear was still in her eyes, but the delirium was gone. "You're up," Garrett said, turning back to the stove. "Stupid move. Your ankle isn't healed." "I needed to see where I was," she said. Her voice was hoarse but cultured. It sounded like city drawing rooms and finishing schools completely out of place in his rough cabin. "You're at Iron Rock Ranch, 5 miles outside Blackwater Ridge." Garrett plated the bacon and poured a mug of coffee. He set them on the table and pulled out a chair. "Sit. Eat." She hesitated, then limped to the table and sat. She stared at the food like she hadn't seen a meal in weeks. She took a bite of bacon, her hands shaking. "I don't have any money to pay you," she said softly, not looking at him. "Everything I had, I used it to bribe the train staff." "Did I ask for money?" Garrett leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. She looked up at him then. "Men usually do. Money or something else." Garrett's eyes narrowed. The bitterness in her voice told him everything about the last few years of her life. "I ain't other men," Garrett said. "And I don't want your money. I want the truth." She stiffened. "The truth is dangerous." "So is bleeding to death in a livestock wagon," Garrett countered. "You talked in your sleep, lady. You talked about a man named Beauregard. You talked about murder." She went pale, the fork clattering onto the plate. "If I tell you," she whispered, "you become an accessory. If they find me, they'll burn this place to the ground." Garrett looked around the cabin. He looked at the rifle hanging over the mantel. He looked back at her, at the bruises fading to yellow, at the defiance trying to push through the terror. "Let him try," Garrett said. "Now, what's your name?" She took a deep breath. She looked him in the eye, and for the first time, he saw the steel in her spine. "My name is Evelyn Sterling, and I am the rightful owner of the Sterling silver mine. And my uncle, he intends to cut my heart out to get it." Garrett poured himself a cup of coffee and sat opposite her. "Well then, Miss Sterling," he said, "it looks like we've got a war to plan." The Wyoming winter settled over Iron Rock Ranch like a heavy woolen blanket, suffocating the world in silence and white. For 3 weeks, the snow didn't stop. It piled against the windows of the cabin, sealing Evelyn and Garrett in a cocoon of firelight and wood smoke. Evelyn's recovery was slow, a painful crawl back to humanity. The bruises on her face faded from angry purple to a sickly yellow, then finally vanished, revealing the porcelain skin beneath. But the fear didn't fade as easily as the bruises. She jumped at the sound of a log settling in the fire. She flinched when Garrett moved too quickly. Garrett noticed it all. He didn't coddle her, but he adjusted his movements. He walked heavier so she'd hear him coming. He kept his voice low. Life in the cabin developed a rhythm. In the mornings, Garrett would bundle up to tend to the horses and break the ice on the water trough. Evelyn, unable to sit idle, took to mending his clothes. The rough canvas of his work shirts tore her fingers, but she persisted stitching with the same stubborn precision she had once used on embroidery hoops in Carson City. One evening, Garrett came in stomping snow off his boots. He smelled of cold air and hay. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the table. Evelyn had set out dinner. It wasn't much venison stew and cornbread, but she had found a tablecloth in an old trunk and set the table with a strange, formal dignity. "You didn't have to do this," Garrett rumbled, hanging his coat by the door. "I am not an invalid anymore, Garrett," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "And I refuse to be a parasite. I can't chop wood and I can't ride, but I can make sure you don't eat out of a tin can, like a savage." Garrett's lip twitched, the closest thing to a smile she'd seen yet. "Savage, huh? I've been called worse." They sat to eat. The silence between them had changed. In the beginning it was tense, filled with suspicion. Now it was companionable, heavy with things unsaid. "My uncle—" Evelyn started breaking the silence. She stared into her stew. "He wasn't always a monster. After my father died in the mine collapse, Beauregard was kind. He handled the estate. He handled the lawyers. I was grieving and I trusted him." Garrett paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Money changes people, Evelyn, especially the kind of money your daddy had." "It wasn't just the money," she said, her eyes darkening. "It was the control. He wanted to merge the Sterling mines with the railroad consortium. My father always refused. He said the railroad men were crooks. When I turned 21 and legally inherited the controlling shares, I told Beauregard I intended to honor my father's wishes. That's when he locked you up, Garrett asked. That's when he hired a doctor to declare me hysterical, she corrected. He was going to have me committed to an asylum in the East. With me incapacitated, he would have power of attorney. The marriage? That was his backup plan. He wanted to marry me off to one of his business partners, a man named Jasper Vance, a man who makes my uncle look like a saint. Garrett's grip tightened on his spoon until his knuckles turned white. Jasper Vance, the cattle baron from Cheyenne. Evelyn looked up surprised. You know him? I know of him, Garrett said darkly. He hires men to burn out homesteaders who won't sell their land. If Vance is involved, this isn't just about a mine, Evelyn. It's about an empire. He stood up, abruptly pacing to the window. The mention of Vance had shifted his mood. The protector was gone. The soldier was back. You need to learn to shoot, he said, turning to face her. I've never held a gun, Evelyn stammered. Well, you're gonna learn. Tomorrow. The next morning was bright and painfully cold. The sun reflected off the snow with a glare that watered the eyes. Garrett set up a row of empty whiskey bottles on a fence post 50 yards from the porch. He handed Evelyn his Colt Peacemaker. The gun was heavy, dragging her arm down. It smelled of oil and burnt powder. It's too heavy, she complained, using both hands to lift it. It's supposed to be heavy, Garrett said, stepping behind her. It's a machine meant to stop a man. Treat it with respect. He moved closer, his chest brushing her back. Evelyn's breath hitched. He was warm, a solid wall against the biting wind. He reached around her, his large, rough hands covering hers, guiding her grip. Feet apart, he murmured, his mouth close to her ear. Don't lock your elbows. You need to absorb the kick. Evelyn tried to focus on the bottle, but her senses were overwhelmed by him. The scent of tobacco and pine, the heat of his body, the sheer size of him. For the first time since she arrived, she wasn't thinking about survival. She was thinking about the man holding her. Breathe in, Garrett instructed. Let half of it out. Squeeze, don't pull. She squeezed. The gun roared. The recoil jarred her shoulders, and she stumbled back, landing hard against Garrett's chest. He steadied her, his hands lingering on her waist. The bottle on the fence remained perfectly intact. I missed, she said, frustrated. You didn't drop the gun, Garrett said softly. That's a start. He didn't let go of her immediately. They stood there in the snow, the echo of the shot fading into the mountains. Evelyn turned in his arms, looking up at him. The brim of his hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but she could see the intensity there. Why are you helping me, Garrett? She asked, the question hanging in the frozen air. You could have dropped me at the sheriff's office. You could have taken the reward. Garrett looked away toward the tree line. I had a brother, Liam. He was younger, softer than me. He got in trouble with a card shark in Abilene. I was busy, chasing a bounty. By the time I got to him, he was gone. He looked back at her, his expression raw. I couldn't save him, but I can keep the vultures off you. Evelyn reached up her gloved hand, touching his rough cheek. It was a bold move, one that shocked them both. You aren't just saving me, Garrett, she whispered. You're saving yourself. For a moment, it looked like he might kiss her. His head dipped, his eyes dropping to her lips. The air between them crackled hotter than the fire inside. Then a distant sound shattered the moment. Crack. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the snap of a dry branch in the woods. Garrett spun around, pushing Evelyn behind him in one fluid motion. He leveled the Colt at the tree line, his demeanor instantly shifting from tender to lethal. Get inside, he commanded, his voice ice. Garrett, inside Evelyn. Now. She scrambled onto the porch and into the house. Garrett stood in the snow for 10 minutes, unmoving, watching the white stillness. He saw nothing, no movement, no tracks. But he knew that sound. It wasn't a deer. Deer didn't snap branches unless they were running. This was a boot, a heavy boot trying to be quiet. They had been found. Garrett didn't sleep that night. He sat in the rocking chair by the door, the Winchester rifle across his lap. The snow had started falling again, covering whatever tracks had been made in the woods, but the feeling in his gut remained. By dawn, he had made a decision. He couldn't fight a war blind. He needed to know who was out there, how many of them there were, and if the town had turned against him. "I'm going to town," he told Evelyn as she emerged from the bedroom, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Panic flared in her eyes. "You're leaving me? I have to. We're low on ammunition and flour, and I need to see which way the wind is blowing." He walked over to her, handing her a small, deadly-looking Derringer pistol. "2 shots. It's for close range. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me, you put both bullets in their chest. Understand?" Evelyn took the gun, her hand trembling slightly, then steadying. "I understand. Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." He saddled Thunder, the massive roan horse, and rode out. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with more snow. The ride to Blackwater Ridge took 2 hours in the drifts. When Garrett rode into town, the atmosphere was different. The usual sleepy lethargy of the outpost was gone. There were horses hitched in front of the saloon that didn't belong to locals. Fine thoroughbreds with expensive saddles. Garrett pulled his hat low and tied Thunder at the general post. He walked with his usual loping stride, but his eyes were scanning everything. Rooflines, alleyways, windows. He went to the general store first. Horace, the owner who had been at the station, looked nervous when Garrett walked in. "Morning, Garrett," Horace squeaked, wiping the counter nervously. "Horace, give me 3 boxes of 45 cartridges and a sack of flour." Horace scurried to get the items. As he placed them on the counter, he leaned in his voice a whisper. "There are men asking about you, Garrett. Strangers. They've been buying rounds at the saloon, showing a picture of a lady." "What did you tell them?" Garrett asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I told them nothing, I swear. But Elias the brakeman. I saw him talking to the man in the fancy suit. He was pointing toward the North Pass." Garrett's jaw tightened. Elias. He should have thrown the man off the train himself. "Thanks, Horace." Garrett threw a coin on the counter, more than the goods were worth, and grabbed his supplies. He should have left then. He should have ridden hard for the ranch. But Garrett needed to see the face of the enemy. He crossed the muddy street to the Blackwater Saloon. The doors swung open, and the warmth and noise hit him. The piano player was hammering out a tinny tune, but the room went quiet as Garrett entered. He walked to the bar, ignoring the stares. He ordered a whiskey. In the reflection of the dirty mirror behind the bar, he saw them. A table in the corner. 4 men. 3 were clearly hired guns, rough-scarred, wearing low-slung holsters. But the 4th man was different. He wore a tailored suit, a silk vest, and a bowler hat. He was clean-shaven, with cold, dead eyes. Jasper Vance's right-hand man. A fixer named Silas. No, not Ilas. Victor Krell, a man known for carving people up with a Bowie knife when guns didn't work. Krell stood up and walked to the bar standing next to Garrett. He smelled of lavender water and rot. "You're the rancher," Krell said. His voice was smooth like oil on water. "Holloway." Garrett didn't look at him. He swirled his whiskey. "I am. I'm looking for a runaway, a mentally disturbed young woman. Stole a great deal of money from her family. We have reason to believe she got off the train here." Krell slid a photograph onto the bar. It was an old tintype of Evelyn, looking younger and happier. "Her uncle is very worried. There's a $5,000 reward for her safe return, and $1,000 for the man who points the way." Garrett took a sip of his drink. He looked at the photo, then at Krell. $5,000 is a lot of money," Garrett said. "It is. Enough to buy a lot of cows, or fix up a failing ranch." Garrett turned his body fully toward Krell. He towered over the city man. I saw a woman at the station a few weeks back. Garrett lied smoothly. Looked sick, hopped a wagon headed west toward the mining camps in Idaho. Didn't catch her name. Krell stared at him. The saloon was deathly silent. Krell's eyes searched Garrett's face for a tick, a sweat bead, a lie. Garrett gave him nothing but granite. Idaho, Krell repeated slowly. That's a long way. It's a big country, Garrett said. He downed his whiskey, placed the glass on the bar, and turned to leave. Miss Holloway, Krell called out just as Garrett reached the doors. Garrett stopped, his hand hovering inches from his gun. My sources say you took a heavy load in your wagon that day. Awfully heavy for just barbed wire. Garrett looked back over his shoulder. I mind my business, friend. I suggest you mind yours. The weather turns bad fast around here. People get lost in the snow and aren't found until the spring thaw. He pushed through the doors and stepped into the cold. He didn't run. He walked calmly to Thunder, untied the reins and mounted. But the moment he was out of sight of the main street, he dug his spurs in. They knew. The mention of the wagon confirmed it. Elias had talked. They weren't going to Idaho. They were coming to Iron Rock. Garrett pushed the horse hard, the wind whipping his face. He was halfway home, cutting through a narrow canyon known as Devil's Throat, when instinct screamed at him. The birds had stopped singing. He hauled on the reins, sliding Thunder to a halt, just as a rifle crack echoed off the canyon walls. A bullet whizzed past his ear, taking a chunk out of his hat brim. Ambush. Garrett threw himself off the saddle, slapping the horse's flank to send it running. He dove behind a fallen boulder as two more shots kicked up snow where he had just been standing. They had sent scouts ahead. They were trying to cut him off from the ranch. From Evelyn. Garrett pulled the Winchester from the scabbard he'd dragged with him. He scanned the ridge. 2 puffs of smoke, one on the left, one on the right. They had the high ground. You're making a mistake, Holloway, a voice shouted from the rocks. It was one of the rough men from the saloon. Give us the girl and you walk away. Garrett racked the lever of his rifle. Come and get her. He popped up, firing 2 rapid shots at the left ridge. A man screamed and tumbled down the slope, landing in a heap of snow and crimson. The second man opened fire bullets, chipping away at Garrett's cover. Garrett waited, timing the shots. Bang, bang, bang. Click, reload. Garrett stood up, took aim, and fired a single shot. The second gunman on the right ridge jerked backward and went still. Garrett didn't wait to check the bodies. He whistled for Thunder. The horse, trained for gunfire, trotted back from the brush. Garrett vaulted into the saddle. The secrecy was over. The diplomacy was over. Krell and his army were likely an hour behind the scouts. Garrett rode like a demon possessed. The image of Evelyn alone in the cabin with nothing but a 2-shot pistol burned in his mind. He had promised to keep the vultures off. As the ranch came into view, his heart hammered against his ribs. The chimney was smoking. The house looked peaceful. He skidded the horse to a halt at the porch and kicked the door open. Evelyn! She was standing by the fireplace. The derringer pointed at the door with shaking hands. When she saw it was him, she lowered it, letting out a sob of relief. Garrett, I heard shooting. Pack a bag, Garrett ordered, grabbing boxes of ammunition from the shelf. Blankets, food, whiskey. Now, what happened? Did you find them? Garrett turned to her, his face streaked with sweat and grim determination. They found us. There's a dozen men coming up the pass, led by a butcher named Krell. We can't hold the cabin. It's a death trap. Where are we going? Evelyn cried, shoving bread and cheese into a sack. Garrett looked out the window at the towering iron cliff that gave the ranch its name. There were old mining caves up there, tunnels that ran deep into the mountain. Defensible. Hidden. We're going up the mountain, Garrett said. If they want to fight, I'm going to give them a war. He grabbed her arm, pulling her towards the door. The wind howled, carrying the faint rhythmic thrum of hoofbeats in the distance. The devil had arrived at Iron Rock. The ascent to the old mine entrance was a brutal, lung-burning scramble up a scree slope slick with fresh snow. Garrett moved with the desperate agility of a mountain cat, pulling Evelyn up the steepest sections, his grip bruising her arm. They didn't speak. The air was too thin and the danger too close. Behind them, down in the valley, a pillar of black smoke began to rise, staining the pristine white sky. Evelyn stopped, turning to look back. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The ranch house, the sturdy log cabin that had been her sanctuary, the place where she had learned to breathe again, was engulfed in flames. Orange tongues of fire licked at the roof, and even from this distance, she imagined she could hear the wood groaning as it died. "Don't look," Garrett rasped, tugging her forward. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were burning with a fury colder than the wind. "It's just wood and stone. We're still breathing." "They burned it," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Because of me." "They burned it because they're evil men, Evelyn, not because of you. Now move or we die with the house." They reached the mouth of the mine just as the first bullets began to chip at the rocks around them. The entrance was a dark, gaping maw in the cliff face, framed by rotting timber beams that smelled of wet earth and decay. Garrett shoved Evelyn inside and spun around, dropping to one knee behind a pile of tailings. He raised the Winchester and fired 3 shots in rapid succession down the slope. A man yelled in pain, and the pursuers scrambled for cover behind the scrub oaks. "That'll hold 'em for a minute," Garrett muttered. He stood up, wincing. He touched his side. His hand came away red. "You're hit," Evelyn said, her voice trembling but authoritative. "Graze, ricochet. It's nothing." Garrett turned to the darkness of the tunnel. "We need to go deep. There's a ventilation shaft about a half-mile in that opens up on the north ridge. If we can get there, we can flank them." He fumbled in his pack and produced a lantern, lighting it with a strike-anywhere match. The flame flared, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn walls. "Stay close," he commanded. "These tunnels haven't been worked in 10 years. The floor is rotten in places." They moved into the belly of the mountain. The silence here was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of their boots and the rhythmic drip of water. The temperature dropped a damp chill that seeped through their coats. As they walked, the reality of their situation settled over them. They were trapped in a tomb, hunted by a dozen killers. "Garrett," Evelyn said softly, her voice echoing slightly. "If they catch us." "They won't." "If they do," she insisted, stopping him. She grabbed the lapels of his duster, forcing him to look at her. "I'm not going back to that cellar. I won't let my uncle win. If it comes down to it, don't let them take me alive." Garrett stared at her. In the flickering lantern light, she looked like a vengeful spirit, beautiful, terrified, and utterly ferocious. He reached up his thumb, tracing the line of her jaw. "I promised to keep the vultures off you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't say anything about killing you. As long as I have a bullet left, you're safe." He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, romantic kiss. It was desperate, tasting of adrenaline and blood. It was a seal, a promise made in the dark. When he pulled away, his eyes were fierce. "Now let's go show these city boys what happens when they walk into a bear's den." They reached a junction in the tunnel. To the left, the path sloped downward into black water. To the right it climbed. Garrett steered them right. Suddenly a sound echoed through the tunnel behind them. Not boots, voices. "Holloway!" Krell's voice boomed, amplified by the acoustics of the mine. "There's nowhere to go. The back exit, we found it on the map. I have 3 men waiting at the north ridge. You're walking into a slaughter." Garrett froze. He looked at Evelyn. The color drained from his face. "He's bluffing," Evelyn whispered. "Krell doesn't bluff," Garrett said grimly. "He's a professional. If he says he has the exit covered, He does. So we're trapped, Evelyn said. Not yet. Garrett looked around the tunnel. He pointed to a stack of crates near the wall covered in a thick layer of dust and spiderwebs. This was a silver mine, hard rock. They used blasting powder. Evelyn, the daughter of a mining magnate, moved toward the crates. She wiped the dust away to reveal the faded stenciling danger. Hercules powder, cool. She pried the lid off one. Inside were sticks of dynamite, sweating nitroglycerin. They were unstable, volatile. One wrong move, and they would blow the top off the mountain. Garrett, she said, her mind racing. This is old. It's sweating. It's incredibly dangerous. Good, Garrett said. I like dangerous. He pulled a coil of fuse wire from his saddlebag. I'm going to rig the tunnel. Bring the roof down behind us. It'll cut them off, and we can find another way out through the drainage drifts. No, Evelyn said. She looked at the dynamite, then back at the tunnel entrance. A plan was forming in her mind, cold, calculated, and terrifying. If we collapse the tunnel behind us, we're still trapped in here with no exit. We need to collapse the tunnel on top of them. Garrett looked at her, impressed and slightly terrified. That's a precision job, Evelyn. You miss the timing by a second, we bury ourselves. My father taught me how to read a vein, she said, her hands moving deftly over the rotting crates. I know the structure of these supports. If we blow the main load-bearing beam at the junction, the ceiling comes down for 50 yards. But we need bait. Garrett checked his Winchester. He had 5 rounds left. I'm the bait, he said. Garrett, no. I'll hold them at the junction. He cut her off. You rig the fuse. When I give the signal, you light it and run like hell for the upper chamber. Don't look back. I can't leave you, she cried. You aren't leaving me. You're saving me. He shoved the crate into her hands. Go, they're coming. Evelyn didn't argue. She grabbed the dynamite and the fuse, running back toward the junction point, where the timber supports were thickest. Her hands, usually so suited for piano keys, worked with feverish intensity. She wedged the sweating sticks into the crevices of the rotting wood. She stripped the fuse with her teeth, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could hear them now. Boots splashing in puddles, the click of hammers being cocked. Come out, Holloway, Krell yelled closer now. We know you're hurt. We saw the blood. Garrett stood 20 yards down the tunnel, standing in the open, the lantern at his feet illuminating him like a stage actor. He looked relaxed, almost bored. I'm right here, Krell, Garrett shouted. Come and claim your prize. Evelyn finished the knot. She looked at Garrett. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were locked on the darkness ahead. Shadows detached themselves from the gloom. Krell stepped into the light, flanked by 4 men with shotguns. Krell smiled a shark, sensing blood in the water. Smart man, Krell sneered. Where is the girl? She's gone, Garrett lied. Slipped down a crevice. Broke her neck. You wasted a trip. Krell laughed. I don't believe you. Check the side tunnels. 2 men moved forward. Garrett raised his rifle. Bang. 1 man dropped. The tunnel erupted in noise. Krell and his men opened fire. Bullets pinged off the rocks, sending stone shards flying. Garrett dove behind a minecart, firing blindly over the rim. Evelyn! Now! Garrett roared. Evelyn struck the match. The flame flared blue and hot. She touched it to the fuse. It hissed a snake of sparks racing towards the timber. Garrett, run! She screamed. She turned and sprinted up the incline, her lungs burning. Garrett broke cover. He didn't look at Krell. He turned and ran, diving and scrambling toward where Evelyn had disappeared. Shoot him! Krell shrieked. Stop him! Bullets whizzed past Garrett. One clipped his shoulder, spinning him around, but he kept moving, adrenaline overriding the pain. He saw the sparks hit the dynamite. He saw Evelyn reaching out her hand from the upper ledge. He leaped, grabbing her hand just as the world turned white. The explosion wasn't a sound. It was a physical blow. It punched the air out of the tunnel, slamming Garrett and Evelyn against the hard stone floor of the upper chamber. Then came the roar, a deafening, grinding crash as millions of tons of rock and earth gave way. The mountain shook. Dust billowed up the shaft in a choking cloud, instantly extinguishing the lantern. They lay there in the pitch black, coughing, gasping for air. The rumbling slowly faded, replaced by the terrifying sound of settling rocks and the silence of the grave. Garrett. Evelyn coughed, her voice small in the darkness. "I'm here," he groaned. His voice was strained. "I'm here." He fumbled for the matches. The first one broke. The second one flared to life. They were in a small chamber, dead-ended. Below them, where the tunnel had been, was a solid wall of rubble. The junction was gone. Krell and his men were buried under 50 feet of granite. Garrett tried to sit up and cried out, collapsing back. "Garrett!" Evelyn crawled to him. His left leg was pinned under a slab of rock that had fallen from the ceiling during the shock wave. Blood was soaking his trouser leg, dark and fast. "It's broken." Garrett gritted out, his face grey with shock. "Femur, maybe. I can't move it." Evelyn looked at the rock. It was massive, too heavy for her to lift. "We're trapped," she said, panic rising in her throat. "The exit is blocked. Krell's men are outside." "Krell is dead," Garrett wheezed. "But we're running out of air. The blast, it used up the oxygen." He was right. The air was already getting thin, stale. The lantern flame was flickering low. "I have to get this off you," Evelyn said. She looked around frantically. She saw a rusted iron pry bar lying near an abandoned cart. She grabbed it. It was heavy, cold iron. She wedged it under the slab of rock. "On 3, she said, bracing her feet. She was a petite woman, built for ballrooms, not labor. But in that moment, she summoned every ounce of strength she possessed. 1, 2, 3, she heaved. Her muscles screamed. The bar bent. The rock groaned and shifted an inch. Garrett gritted his teeth and dragged his leg free, screaming in agony as the bone grated. Evelyn dropped the bar, the rock slamming back down. She fell to her knees, panting. "We have to move," Garrett whispered, verging on unconsciousness. "Drainage drift. There's a crawl space." Evelyn wrapped his arm around her shoulder. "Lean on me. I've got at you." This time she carried him. She dragged him through the narrow, wet drainage tunnel. The water was freezing, soaking her dress, numbing her legs. Garrett was dead weight, his boots scraping the stone. "Keep going, cowboy," she muttered, tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to die. Not after all this." They crawled for what felt like hours. Evelyn's hands were raw and bleeding. Her knees were bruised, but she saw it a pinprick of light ahead. Daylight. She pulled him toward it. The opening was small, hidden by thick brush on the side of the mountain. She shoved through the branches and collapsed onto the snow. The cold air hit them like a blessing. They were alive. But they weren't alone. "Well, ain't that a sight?" Evelyn looked up, freezing. Standing 10 feet away, leaning against a pine tree, was a man. He wore a marshal's badge, but standing next to him was a tall, silver-haired man in a heavy fur coat. Beauregard Sterling, Evelyn's uncle. He held a revolver loosely in his hand. He looked at Evelyn, dirty, bloody, wearing a torn dress and a man's duster, with a look of utter distaste. "You look terrible, my dear," Beauregard said smoothly. "I expected better." Evelyn stood up. She was shaking, but she placed herself between her uncle and the semi-conscious Garrett. "It's over, uncle," she said. "Krell is dead. His men are buried." "Krell was a blunt instrument," Beauregard sighed. "Expensive but replaceable. I came to ensure the job was done correctly. Marshal Faintheart here was just for the legality of identifying the body." The marshal looked uneasy. "Mr. Sterling, you said the girl was mentally unstable. You didn't say anything about a war. Quiet fool, Beauregard snapped. He raised the gun, aiming it at Garrett's chest. Step aside, Evelyn. You're coming home. The asylum will be quite comfortable, I assure you, once I have your signature on the transfer papers. No, Evelyn said. Step aside, or I kill the cowboy first. Evelyn reached into her pocket. Her hand closed around the small derringer Garrett had given her. 2 shots. That was all she had. You won't shoot him, Evelyn said, her voice eerily calm. And why is that? Because you need the money, she said, taking a step toward him. The mine is failing, isn't it? That's why you're so desperate. If I die, the estate goes into probate for years. You'll be bankrupt before you see a dime. Beauregard's eye twitched. She had hit the mark. I don't need to kill you, he snarled, but I can hurt you. He shifted his aim from Garrett to Evelyn's leg. Bang! The shot rang out. Evelyn flinched, waiting for the pain. But it didn't come. Beauregard looked confused. He looked down at his chest. A red blossom was spreading across his white shirt. He looked up, his eyes wide with shock, and crumpled into the snow. Behind him, lying prone in the snow, Garrett Halloway held his smoking Colt Peacemaker. His hand was shaking, but his aim had been true. The marshal stared at the body, then at Garrett, then at Evelyn. He slowly holstered his gun and raised his hands. I didn't sign up for this, the marshal stammered. He told me you were a fugitive. Evelyn walked over to her uncle. He was gone. The monster who had haunted her life was just a dead man in the snow. She turned to the marshal. My name is Evelyn Sterling. I am the owner of the Sterling Silver Mines. This man, she pointed to Garrett, saved my life from a kidnapping attempt orchestrated by my uncle. You can take the body back to town. Tell the judge what happened. The marshal nodded, pale and shaking. Yes, ma'am. I'll get the buckboard. Evelyn ran back to Garrett. He had dropped the gun and was lying back, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. Garrett. She fell to her knees beside him. Garrett, stay with me. He opened his eyes. They were hazy, but he smiled. Did I get him? You got him, she sobbed, pressing her hands to his chest. You saved me. Nah, Garrett whispered, his hand finding hers. We saved each other. 6 months later. The wildflowers were blooming in the valley of Blackwater Ridge. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and warming earth. The Iron Rock Ranch looked different. The charred remains of the old cabin had been cleared away. In its place stood a new house, larger, with big glass windows and a wide porch that looked out over the mountains. Evelyn Sterling, no Evelyn Halloway, sat on the porch swing, a ledger open on her lap. She was dressed in practical ranching clothes, but with a silk scarf tied around her neck. She heard the jingle of spurs and looked up. Garrett was walking up from the barn. He walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the mine, but he moved with the same quiet strength as before. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, tipping his hat back. Mail's in, he said, tossing a bundle of letters onto her lap. More offers for the mine. Tell them it's not for sale, Evelyn said, closing the ledger. We're converting it. No more silver. We're going to use the tunnels for mushroom farming or cheese aging, something that doesn't require dynamite. Garrett chuckled, climbing the steps to sit beside her. Cheese, a cheese baroness. The papers will love that. Let them talk, she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. I'm done with the papers. Garrett wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. The nightmares still came sometimes for both of them, but when they did, they had each other to wake up to. You know, Garrett rumbled, looking out at the green valley. They still tell stories about you in town. The woman who collapsed at the station. Evelyn smiled, tracing the scar on his hand. And what do they say? They say she died that day. Garrett said, softly, kissing the top of her head. And a warrior was born. Evelyn looked at the man who had carried her away from death, and then at the home they had built from the ashes. "They're right," she whispered. She did. And that is the story of Evelyn Sterling and Garrett Halloway. It wasn't the fairy tale rescue the town gossips expected. It was a battle fought in the snow and the dark where the damsel became the hero, and the lone wolf learned to let someone in. It reminds us that sometimes the hardest journeys lead us exactly where we belong. If you enjoyed this story of survival, justice, and romance in the Wild West, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. And tell me in the comments, would you have lit that fuse? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.